Marvel Snap's newest game mode exclusive card, Stick, is really good, but what does it mean to be really good in the way that Stick is really good? Stick is a 4/3 with an on-reveal ability that gives his power to the next card you play. This is very similar to Maverick, a notably powerful card already. And while I do think it would be fair to evaluate it as slightly worse than Maverick, it also gets one really important advantage that Maverick didn't have, which is that you get to play Stick with Maverick. And I think the biggest thing I want to get across when talking about a card like Stick is how specific the ways cards that can be good in Marvel Snap, even metagame definingly good in Marvel Snap, can be. What I mean by this is that Stick is one of the most limited archetypal cards we have ever seen. He is the second best thing at doing the thing that he does. But the thing that he does works so well with something that is already good. So what I want to talk about here is what is it that makes a card good? And what is it that you should be thinking about when we use these terms like good and bad and worth it and not worth it to describe cards that actually exist in a sort of much more complex context than that? And Stick is a great way to talk about this, because it's impossible to talk about Stick without talking about all the other stuff that he goes with. The first and most obvious is Maverick. You play Stick with Maverick for a bunch of reasons, largely revolving around increasing buffs going forward into the game. Just the baseline level of this is playing a Maverick, activating the Maverick on the Stick, and passing the Stick buff onto a Prodigy, which then copies the Maverick. You can pretty easily see how this scales up consistently and gets multiplied in effectiveness by cards like Storm, Horseman of Famine, and Agony that can get you started from a higher position and also buff the later links of the chain. The premise here is pretty straightforward. More of these effects is good. Captain Carter tends to show up in Stick decks as well, partially because she works so well with Maverick, and partially because she is both the start and end of one of those chains. You can use Captain Carter as the recipient of a buff loop, where you have played Prodigy and Maverick and Stick and gotten to a point where you've done a bunch of ridiculous stuff, or you can use her as the starter of a buff loop, passing her power on to a Stick or a Maverick that you have played in the back row behind her. This makes her particularly versatile. Another card you see a lot with Stick is the Grand Master, in much the same way that Maverick tends to enjoy copying itself. One of the big advantages that Stick holds over Maverick, despite a more expensive cost and I would argue a more restrictive piece of output, is that he can be Grandmastered meaningfully. And of course, you're going to see a decent amount of Mother Askani, who works with all of these cards incredibly well. Again, when we talk about what Stick adds to decks that are doing this Maverick Carter stuff, it's effectively a second Maverick. So Mother Askani also adding a second Maverick, or if you will, when you copy a Stick, a third Maverick. You end up being able to loop these buffs higher and higher and higher. We should also probably talk about output. A lot of the cool output of Stick obviously goes on to Brood in those buff decks, but Brood isn't the only thing that you just build up a big buff wave for and then multiply it by 3. There's other things that you can do with that buff wave as well. Zombie Galacti, a deck that really got better when it got Maverick 1, is getting notably better getting Maverick 2. The ability to pass these buffs on is really important for a deck that scales almost entirely with the size of one card. So really anything that allows you to start chaining these buffs, Forge into Maverick, into Stick, gets you to a much bigger Zombie Galacti than was previously possible. And while I do think Galactus is roughly a side grade or downgrade to Brood in a lot of these kind of stacking buff decks, you can very easily use him to catch opponents off guard in very funny, entertaining, and complex and interesting ways. So we've talked about what this card is and what cards go with it. And the reason I'm structuring the video like this is because this is a super weird card to talk about. Because if you ask me, the deck I'm about to show you is probably the best deck in the game. But It's also probably the only thing that actually wants to play Stick, with a couple like notable honorable mentions that are much further down on the totem pole here. And so my question to you is, what does it mean for this card to be a good card? Is a good card a card that is an important part of the best deck? Because if so, Stick is a really good card. Is a good card a card that defines the metagame on its own terms? Something like Starlord and Sholau that were these build-arounds that did that. Because Stick isn't doing that, but he is really important to a deck that I think you could argue is doing that. It's a very interesting question. And I do think that talking about the deck that's going to show up on your screen in just a second is probably where you'll find your answer. This deck is, to me and many others in High Infinite, the scariest thing to see in the entire game at this point. It is an absolute terror that is extremely difficult to snap into because they take multiple turns off, and by the time you feel confident snapping, usually around turn 5, you might be in trouble or the game might already be decided. One of the big issues with this deck in terms of playing against it is just how little they have to do on turns 3 and 4 to make you feel like it is an untenable situation. Something as simple as skip, Storm, Mother Askani is the kind of thing they can snap on and you might have to leave on. That's how dangerous this deck is. This deck is doing a ton of different, incredibly powerful and incredibly synergistic things, from using Grandmaster for Mother Askani and Stick, to having Hope Summers to enable Stick to be played on the final turn of the game alongside something like a Brood. You get to do stuff like use your Hope Summers to create an incredibly powerful Captain Carter lane that then has a Maverick and a Prodigy in it, and then you use that Maverick on a Stick, and then you use that Stick buff on a Brood, and you can kind of see where this game is going from that point, right? You're gonna win it. One of the interesting things about this deck, though, is it is the least surfer of any permutation of this. In fact, many people at High Infinite have been cutting Silver Surfer from this list in order to include Luke Cage, specifically just to deal with people who are afflicting this deck as a method of dealing with what its output can be. Another interesting dynamic that's developed as this deck has become more and more solidified is that it is a deck that has very powerful snaps, but also I think a lot of people respect it. And furthermore, when you look at stat sites, it doesn't really seem to percolate down in meaningful ways. This is a deck that basically everyone at High Infinite thinks is probably the best deck in the game, but when you actually look at the stats from like 40 to 99, it's not really showing up either in the numbers or power level that you'd expect, which leads me to believe that this deck is a deck that is fairly difficult to play, analogous to move bounce, and can lead people astray if they're not picking the right lines. I spent a little bit of time spectating Browday, who's ranked in the top 20 right now, and this deck was confusing even to him. And I think that that is meaningful when we talk about what this deck is and what it means for a card to be good. Because I think a lot of people watch these videos and they think if KMBest says this card is good at High Infinite, that means it's going to be good everywhere. But I don't really think that's necessarily true. And this is definitely going to be a deck that puts that to the test. The closest analog to this deck that I can come up with is Move Bounce during that brief moment where it was extremely powerful at High Infinite and all you'd see on YouTube were people at High Infinite complaining about it. And then it never really showed up lower down because it was just a difficult, decision-heavy, and very hard to plan out deck that didn't have a lot of room for error. And I think this deck is the same. You really only are playing the game on like 4 turns, which means that any of your decisions that you make incorrectly can ruin your entire game plan. You make the wrong decision on turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, all of them can actually lose you the game. And that is not a fun feeling for a lot of people, and it's definitely a very intense experience to try to pilot this deck. I'll also argue, however, that it's very rewarding. The output that you can get out of this deck is genuinely as big as anything can get. One of the really interesting things, though, is that after Stick's release, one play tendency I've noticed is people tend to play more towards the combo. And I get that. It's cool. It's the new card. You can now double your doubles and double. That's what Marvel Snap has been about for a while. But it also makes you a little bit more vulnerable to counterplay, like doing things that are going to, say, play Shadow King Grandmaster on the final turn of the game. That's gonna beat you a lot of the time, right? And so you get this vulnerability not just to counterplay like that at the end of the game, but also because you become a little bit more flowcharty as a deck, you get a little bit more vulnerable to things like Red Guardian, things like Deafening Chord, things like Cosmic Ghost Rider that are meaningfully going to be able to interact with you face up. It's why one of the things that I think about when I see this deck is, are we going to to be able to, in a few weeks or so, once people start countering this, especially as we look towards the Golden Gauntlet, which is going to be happening on June 6th, get some versions of Cosmo in there instead of Surfer? Or are we going to be better off just trying to figure out what the tech is to win the mirror when we're playing 11 of the 12 same cards? I think that's also a possible direction that might need to be explored. Largely, my take on this deck is that I think it's an extremely powerful deck that has enough intricacies and nuances that make it pretty complex for people to pilot. So I'm not sure it'll actually percolate downwards, and more to the point, when you ask if a card is good, and this is the answer I give you, which is to say it's really good for me, it's really good for a lot of people at High Infinite, well, does that mean it's going to be good for you? And I think what I'm really trying to get at here is the subjectivity of the words good and bad, or worth it and not worth it, in the context of evaluating Marvel Snap cards, which are overwhelmingly defined by the context of the other cards that exist. If this deck didn't exist, Stick maybe wouldn't have a lot of good homes. If Maverick didn't exist, Stick maybe wouldn't have a lot of good homes too. But all of these things do exist at the same time, and that makes them a very powerful deck in concert with each other. It's actually sort of like another card in this list, Storm, Horseman of Famine. That card does not see play outside of this context for the vast majority of cases. Outside of this deck, I've maybe seen it 1 or 2 times in people playing Nimrod decks, and then since the first week of its release, it's kind of just been here. But is that a good card, or is that a bad card? It's an amazing card in here, maybe even a broken one, but it's not a card that goes anywhere else. And I think that that kind of thing is really what sticks to the top of my brain when talking about Stick. The other thing Stick can do is intensify an already reasonably powerful draw from Zombie Galacti, but I do think that this is maybe a case of not addition by subtraction, but let's call it subtraction by addition, because Zombie Galacti is a combo deck that is built on doing very powerful stuff with 7 turns and multiplying its buffs to create massive output. And one of the things that I've really run into recently is that if my opponent is playing Zombie Galacti and I am playing the Maverick Stick deck, I'm just going to have more points than them, no matter how big the Zombie Galacti gets. Like, that is just, the more time they give me, the better off I am. Like, as long as I draw the cards Captain Carter and Maverick or Stick, and really just like most things the deck does, you are competing on equal basis with Zombie Galacti. And I think that's really down to the strength of the first list, even though it's finicky and a little bit difficult to play, and you can definitely mess yourself up. Anything that can output with Zombie Galacti level of power, benefit from a magic the same way as Zombie Galacti can, and do all of this while just being a bunch of cheap cards, is an extremely powerful space for the entire metagame to revolve around. And I would expect that Stick is one of those cards that helps that deck become one of the things the metagame revolves around. So when I talk about subtraction by addition here, in terms of absolute value, this deck got way better when Stick showed up. But in terms of matchups, I think you got way worse because you have to play against the people who are doing other Stick things. And you're supposed to beat those, but now that they have Stick, I'm not really sure you do. You are legally allowed to play the version of the Surfer deck with Galactus in it. I think it's largely a downgrade from Brood, but it's the same thing where really what you're looking for is a vessel to carry the 75 buff points that you've stacked up over the course of the game. And if you would like that vessel to be Galactus, more power to you. I respect what you're doing here. It is probably a downgrade, but I do respect at least the shot being taken. So with that in mind, it's actually pretty difficult to talk about what this card is, because to me, I would describe it as an archetype all-star. This card is very good in the context of that, I guess we can't even call it a Surfer deck, Captain Carter deck, right? Maverick Stick deck. That's what it is. That's the package it goes with. Those are the things that it does. That's what you can do with it, right? It's not a Surfer card. That package has superseded its previous bounds and gone on to become something totally different and totally grouped separately from what you would reasonably call a Surfer deck. And Stick is definitely a card that pushes it further that direction and further away from being Surfer, while also making it a deck that has incredibly powerful combo lines that can do some really serious damage and some of the strongest snaps in the entire game, in my opinion. The biggest thing about Stick to me, though, is that he kind of only goes there. You're not really ever doing anything with this card on its own terms. Stick is a card that has terms that are dictated to it by the other cards that exist. This is a link in a chain and not a card that you are building around on its own in the same way Maverick was able to be, because he's worse. So how am I supposed to straightforwardly look at you and say that he's a good card? He's a piece of a good deck, but I don't know that he's a good card. He's not doing this on his own. In fact, that deck was already one of the best decks in the game, if not the best going into this, and it got better here, but how much of that is about him? So that's really the question I want you to ask yourselves. Obviously, as a card from Grand Arena, or Team Clash, sorry, this is obviously a card worth picking up. You can get this guy for free. He's a good part of the best deck. Very straightforward. If you have a chance to get a good card for free, you should probably take it. That's definitely one of the messages of this video. But at the same time, I also want you guys to think and to let me know in the comments, what does it mean to be a good card? And in this context, is Stick a card you would consider to be a good card? Because he's definitely like the 5th best card in his deck, and that's the only deck he goes in, but he's really good in that role. He's a superstar role player. It's a interesting phenomenon, I would say. The Andre Iguodala of this deck. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.